The sun had barely broken the horizon when Walter Walt Callan arrived at the gates of Ridgeview National Cemetery. Dressed in a carefully pressed, though time-worn, army dress uniform, he moved slowly but deliberately, his cane tapping against the stone path with each step. The brass on his chest had dulled, the fabric on his sleeves had thinned, and the right shoulder bore a faded patch with the name Beth sewn in crooked blue thread hand, stitched by his late wife during the final weeks of her battle with cancer. He'd promised her he'd wear it to every service for the rest of his life. Today, it was all he had left, of herald of the men who hadn't made it home. Walt approached the gate with quiet purpose, his back stiff despite the arthritis, his white hair peeking from beneath his beret. A young soldier holding a clipboard glanced up, barely registering the old man before returning to his checklist. "Sir, this is a closed ceremony," the soldier said flatly. "You're not on the list." Walt extended a weathered, laminated ID cardone, issued before most of these men were even born. The plastic was cracked, the photo sun-faded, but the words were still clear. Staff Sergeant Walter E. Callan, U.S. Army, honorably discharged. The guard barely looked at it. "This isn't valid anymore. These events require digital clearance." He gestured to a scanner that blinked coldly in the morning light. "You'll need to step aside." Walt didn't argue. He didn't ask for exceptions. He simply nodded, slipped the card back into his coat pocket, and turned away from the gate. He walked a few steps back until he found a low stone wall just beyond the boundary. There, he stood, rigid and silent, the kind of stillness that wasn't about age, but about memory. Just ahead, rows of white chairs were being filled by dignitaries and decorated officers. Flags lined the central path toward the burial platform. Somewhere beneath that canopy lay the urn of Brigadier General Thomas Layton, the man Walt had once carried through sniper fire in the jungle, half conscious and bleeding. They'd served together in '69, fought side by side, saved each other more than once. And now, Walt was here to keep one last promise to make sure Tom wasn't buried alone. He stood in silence, boots together, eyes fixed on the flag ahead. Guests passed him without pause. One or two glanced at him, a flicker of curiosity or pity in their eyes, but none stopped. The younger ones didn't even try to hide their dismissal. A group of junior officers snickered as they walked past. One nudged the other and whispered, "Some museum let their display wander off." Another pointed at the patch on Walt's shoulder. "Looks like something sewn by a kid." The laughter was low, careless, but it carried. Walt heard every word. He didn't flinch. Instead, he raised his left hand, the one not holding the cane, gently pressed it over the patch, shielding Beth's name from view. Not out of shame, but to protect it from the world that no longer seemed to remember what it cost. A breeze swept across the cemetery, lifting the edge of Walt's coat and brushing against the metals that had long since lost their shine. His leg throbbed beneath the fabric-hold shrapnel still lodged deep, a memento no surgeon ever bothered to remove. But he didn't shift, didn't sit, didn't speak. He wasn't here for recognition. He wasn't here for ceremony. He was here because of a man who had once whispered to him in a ditch outside Hugh, "If anything happens, don't let them put me in the ground alone." That memory, more than any list or clearance code, was what brought him here. That and Beth's patch. The one thing he never let anyone else touch. And so, just beyond the gate where no one seemed to see him, Walt Callan stood at attention, an old soldier with no invitation, no welcome, and no intention of leaving. Walt stood alone outside the gate, as the world inside moved on without him. A bugle sounded faintly from the other side of the field, its notes crisp and mournful as the honor guard assembled beneath the canopy. Behind the iron bars, everything unfolded with cold precision rows of dignitaries in polished shoes, press cameras snapping quietly, and white chairs filling one by one. The young soldier at the checkpoint had already turned back to his clipboard, and the moment of rejection seemed to dissolve like mist in the morning air. But for Walt, it hung heavy, not as anger, not even as surprise. Just that familiar ache of being forgotten by the very system he once bled for. A group of younger soldiers passed close behind him, loud and carefree. Their laughter cut across the quiet like a knife. One sipped from a bottle of neon sports drink and muttered, "Who let Grandpa out of the attic?" Another snapped a photo of Walt with his phone, chuckling. "Bet he's one of those stolen valor guys. That patch looks like it came off a teddy bear." He was pointing to the threadbare name stitched into Walt's shoulder beth, sewn unevenly in her final days when her hands had already started to tremble. The patch wasn't regulation. It wasn't supposed to be. It was personal, sacred. And these boys, barely old enough to remember the last war, were treating it like a joke badge from a costume shop. Walt didn't turn. He didn't respond. He kept his posture steady, his chin high, the way he had back in '71, when a colonel read out the casualty list and he stood alone, waiting to hear if the last of his platoon had made it out alive. His grip on the cane tightened slightly, the knuckles white under liver-spotted skin. His right foot ached from standing so long, the metal rod inside humming with every heartbeat. He shifted only once, just enough to adjust his weight, then returned to stillness. If they wanted to laugh, let them. He hadn't come here for their approval. Far ahead, a flag-draped casket was being moved into position. A voice over the PA announced the commencement of formal rites. But from outside the gate, all Walt could hear was the echo of footsteps, the kind he remembered from nights spent dragging wounded men to safety through ankle-deep mud, the shouts of gunfire behind him, the trembling breath of a friend whispering, "Don't stop now, Walt. Just a little further." That voice still echoed now, louder than the mockery of young men who didn't know him, louder than the silence from those who should have remembered. The group of junior officers circled back a few minutes later, maybe bored, maybe just looking for another laugh. One of them stopped directly in front of Walt and squinted at the name on the patch. "Beth," he read out loud, as if testing the word on his tongue. "She? Your nurse or something?" A few others snickered. "Looks like something stitched on a pillowcase." Walt raised his hand slowly, not as a warning, not as a threat, but simply to rest it over the name. The laughter died almost immediately. There was something in the gesture that cut through their immaturity, something that reminded them this wasn't a prop, and this wasn't a joke. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, awkwardly, they walked away, tossing glances over their shoulders. One muttered, "Weird old man," but it lacked the confidence of before. Back at the entrance, the young soldier with the clipboard had noticed none of it. He was helping usher in a group of brass-decorated officers with earpieces and medals gleaming like sunspots. Walt didn't try again. He knew the rules, knew better than to push past protocol. That wasn't how men like him operated. If there was no place for him inside the fence, then he would simply stand outside it. Until it was over. Until every word was spoken. Until every last note of the bugle had faded into the wind. And so he stood, not angry, not ashamed, just quietly resolute. Because men like Walt didn't measure respect by the seats they were given. They measured it by the weight of promises kept, and by how long they were willing to carry the burden of memory, even when no one else seemed to care. From the far side of the ceremony field, partially obscured by a row of white poplars, Captain Hannah Reed watched the old man. At first, she thought he might be a groundskeeper, perhaps a misplaced attendee waiting for a shuttle. But something about his stillness caught her eye. In a crowd full of movement, Walt Callan stood like stone. He hadn't shifted in nearly 20 minutes. His hand, aged but steady, rested on a name patch too small for military issue. Beth. The name pulled at her for reasons she couldn't explain. Captain Reed was sharp decorated for logistics excellence, known among her peers for her sense of order and attention to detail. She had met General Layton only once in person, but like everyone in uniform today, she knew of his storied career. Still, it was this man, this quiet figure just outside the fence who held her attention now. The way he held himself wasn't theatrical. It was deliberate, respectful, as if he were part of the ceremony, even though no one inside had noticed him. She lifted her binoculars. His uniform was old but correct. His beret fit squarely above thick white eyebrows. His ribbons were arranged with care, though the fabric was threadbare. What stood out most was the patch of homespun detail that didn't belong on a regulation jacket. Reed's gut told her it wasn't vanity. It was devotion. She'd seen her own grandfather, a WWII infantryman, keep a photo of her grandmother in his breast pocket for 50 years. He'd called her his compass. That's what the patch looked like to her. A compass stitched by love. She lowered the binoculars and stepped back from the row of dignitaries gathering near the podium. The military band was tuning quietly now. The air smelled of cut grass and shoe polish. She noticed a group of younger soldiers off to the left, laughing awkwardly and sharing something on a phone. Their glances pointed toward the old man. Her eyes narrowed. One of them PFC landers. She thought-tossed his empty drink can into the bushes before slinking back into formation. Sloppy, unprofessional, and worse, unaware of who they might be mocking. Captain Reed's hand hovered near the tablet clipped to her belt. She tapped through the guest registry, flipping through the list of cleared attendees. No Callan. But she scrolled a little further into the appendix of General Layton's personal files documents she'd been asked to archive weeks prior. One small entry stood out. If Walter Callan appears, pause the ceremony. Follow his lead. There were no further instructions. Just that one line. It was signed personally by Layton, 3 weeks before his death. Her chest tightened. It was rare, unheard of, really, for a general to make such an explicit final request involving someone not formally attached to the current command. But there it was, clear as daylight. Captain Reed looked again toward the gate. Walt hadn't moved, not an inch. His hand still rested gently over Beth's name, and now, through the bars, he was saluting. The anthem had begun, carried softly across the field. No one had noticed, but he had. He didn't need permission to stand at attention. He'd earned the right long ago. Reed clipped her tablet shut and turned sharply toward the command tent. Her boots thudded quietly over the grass. Protocol. Be damned. This wasn't some confused bystander or misplaced civilian. This was someone who mattered to the man they were about to bury. Someone who had likely walked through hell long before any of them were ever in uniform. And if General Layton's final wish meant anything, then the ceremony hadn't truly begun yet. Inside the command tent, General Malcolm Keating stood beneath the shade of the canvas roof, reviewing the final procession order with the precision of a man who had led troops in 3 different theaters of war. His uniform was immaculate, his silver stars glinting against deep navy wool. Around him, aides moved like clockwork checking notes, coordinating rifle salutes, arranging flag protocol. Nothing in this ceremony was left to chance. At least, that's what they thought. Captain Hannah Reed entered briskly, saluting. Her expression was controlled, but there was something in her eyes that unsettled. Even Keating, a man not easily rattled. "Captain," he said, "I need a moment, sir. It's about a man at the gate." Keating raised an eyebrow. "This close to the start?" "Yes, sir. He's not on the list, but I think he should be." Keating gave a slow exhale, the kind he reserved for interruptions that smelled of sentiment over protocol. "A protester? Grieving relative?" "No, sir. A veteran, elderly, worn uniform, name's Walter Callan." The name didn't register. Keating shook his head once, then paused. Slowly, he turned to his aide-de-camp, a soft-spoken man named Llewellyn. "Check General Layton's personal directives," he ordered. Llewellyn moved to a secure document case at the rear of the tent and flipped through a folder. Most were standard end-of-life documents, burial preferences, music, flag detail. But nestled in the back was a sealed envelope marked in Layton's own handwriting. "If Callan arrives." The tent fell silent as Keating opened it. Inside was a single page. No formal greeting, no preamble. Just one line. "If Walt Callan shows up, stop everything. Let him carry me." Beneath it, a second sentence, scribbled in uneven ink. "No one else pulled me from that riverbank alive. I made it home because he refused to leave me. This is the only honor that matters." There was no signature. There didn't need to be. Keating stared at the page for a long moment. The air around him shifted. Suddenly, all the polished details of the ceremony at the honor guard, the canopy, the band felt smaller in the shadow of that sentence. He looked to Captain Reed. "You're sure it's him?" "I'm sure, sir. He's been standing at attention outside the gate for nearly an hour. No movement, no complaint. Just waiting." Keating folded the letter slowly, reverently, and slipped it into his inside pocket. "Get the urn." An aide blinked. "Sir?" "You heard me. Bring the urn to the gate." A flurry of movement began. The chaplain paused mid-prayer rehearsal. The honor guard looked up in confusion. The brass ensemble stilled their instruments. Something unplanned was happening, and in a military ceremony, that was unheard of. Keating stepped away from the podium and exited the tent alone. The sun hit him full in the face, and as he crossed the field, all heads turned. Cameras shifted, unsure whether this was an error or a historic moment. His steps were firm, but there was a subtle urgency in his stridea recognition that something sacred was unfolding, just beyond the wrought iron boundary that no one else had thought to cross. When he reached the gate, he found Walt Callan exactly as Reed had described, standing silently, hand over his wife's name, eyes locked on the casket in the distance. The old man didn't flinch when Keating stopped before him, didn't speak, didn't salute, just stared, clear-eyed and quiet. General Keating looked at him fully, deeply, then did something no one expected. He extended his hand. "Sergeant Callan," he said. "He asked for you." Walt blinked, lips parting in surprise. "Tom?" Keating nodded. His words were simple. "If you showed up, no one else would do." Behind him, an aide approached, carrying a polished mahogany urn wrapped in a tri-folded flag. Keating accepted it, then turned and placed it carefully in Walt's hands. "It's time," the general said softly. Walt stared down at the urn. It felt heavier than he expected, like the weight of all the years between them had settled into the grain of the wood. His fingers trembled slightly. But when he looked back up, he was steady again. Then, "Let's bring him home." The cemetery held its breath. From the front rows of the white folding chairs, guests turned to look. The band's instruments lowered mid-note. The color guard froze mid-pivot. Even the press fell silent, lenses focused on the sudden movement near the back of the field. General Keating, still in full dress uniform, was no longer on the podium. He wasn't with the clergy or the family or the honor guard. He was walking not toward the stage, but away from it across the manicured grass toward the main gate. And beside him, in stark contrast to the gleaming ranks of uniformed officers, walked an old man with a cane and a quiet gait. An old man in a faded dress coat with a frayed patch on the shoulder and a mahogany urn cradled gently in his arms. Walter Callan. No one knew who he was. Not yet. But they watched. You could feel the questions ripple through the crowd. Who is he? Why did the general stop everything? Walt didn't hear the murmurs. Didn't see the dozens of eyes trailing him. He walked slowly, deliberately, eyes fixed on the platform ahead where the burial altar stood. The urn in his hands didn't shake. It rested in his arms like it had always belonged there, like he'd been carrying the weight of this moment for decades. The path cleared without command. Soldiers and civilians alike moved aside instinctively. Walt passed between the rows of people, cane tapping softly, shoulders squared. There was no announcement. No formal escort. Just a silence deeper than any anthem. And then, as he crossed the center of the field, the tide shifted. The same group of young soldiers who had mocked him earlier now stood rigid at attention. No officer had ordered them to do so. No one had shouted a command. They just knew. One of them, Landers, was visibly shaken. His chin trembled slightly as Walt passed. His eyes dropped, ashamed. Then, with the smallest of steps, he moved forward. Not much, just enough to close the space between him and Walt. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, voice barely a whisper. Walt didn't stop, but he nodded. Once, a gesture so small it could have been missed by anyone else. But to the boy, it meant everything. A forgiveness he didn't deserve, given anyway. General Keating followed silently, not in front, not behind, but at Walt's side. The way soldiers march when the ranks dissolve and all that's left is one human being walking another home. They reached the marble platform at the head of the ceremony. Walt stepped up, knees stiff, breath shallow. The crowd remained still. The bugler held his instrument at his side. The chaplain lowered his prayer book. Time seemed to stretch across the grass, held open by something sacred. Walt turned to the pedestal, placed the urn carefully upon its center, and rested his palm over the polished wood. He bowed his head not out of exhaustion, but reverence. And beside the urn, from his coat pocket, he removed a soft square of fabric, the patch, Beth's patch, the one no one else had touched in over a decade. He folded it once, then again, and tucked it gently beneath the urn. His wife and his friend, now side by side. No longer forgotten, no longer alone. There was no applause, no anthem, just stillness. Then, as if awakened by the moment, a ripple passed through the crowd. One by one, veterans scattered among the seats stood. Some raised their hands in salute. Others removed caps and held them over their hearts. A woman in a dark blue dress uniform, her silver hair neatly tucked beneath a beret, stood tall and whispered under her breath, "Welcome home." Walt didn't cry, but something in his shoulders softened. And in that moment, no one remembered the clearance lists, or the seating arrangements, or the tight grip of military order. All they saw was a soldier keeping a promise. A man returning someone he loved to the earth with the honor no one else had thought to give. The breeze had stilled, and in its absence, the silence became sacred. Walter Callan stood a moment longer beside the pedestal, his weathered hand resting atop the urn like it was something alive. He could feel the weight of every year since Vietnam settle into his joints, not as pain, but as memory. The patch from Beth now rested beneath the urn, tucked into the folds of the flag like a vow fulfilled. When he finally stepped back, It was without fanfare, without expectation. He wasn't a guest of honor. He wasn't even supposed to be there. And yet somehow, in this moment, all eyes were on him. General Keating took a half step forward but didn't speak. He didn't need to. Everyone understood that the ceremony was no longer following the script. It was following Walt. The chaplain, sensing the shift, closed his prayer book without a word. The color guard, which had been preparing for the final salute, lowered their rifles in respectful pause. The crowd parted again, opening a narrow path between the platform and the command tent. And slowly, deliberately, Walt began to walk. The urn now rested behind him. His part was done. But what followed wasn't about protocol, it was about presence. As Walt passed down the aisle, the young soldiers who had earlier dismissed him stood straighter than they ever had. Their faces, once full of smirks and carelessness, were now locked in sober awe. The one who had touched the patch earlier, Private Landers, stood with arms tight at his sides, chest lifted. He didn't look away this time. As Walt passed him again, Landers whispered, voice tight with emotion, "Sir, I didn't know." Walt didn't slow. But he gave the young man a nod, and in that simple gesture, something heavy was lifted. Because sometimes forgiveness isn't spoken, it's granted in silence. Further down the path, veterans many in civilian clothes stood as well. Some used canes, some leaned on one another, but they rose anyway. One man struggled from a wheelchair, placing a hand to his heart. Another, with trembling fingers, reached into his coat and pulled out a medal he hadn't worn in decades. They saluted Walt, not as a general or a dignitary, but as one of their own, a brother, a keeper of oaths. General Keating walked beside him, step for step, never speaking. He wasn't leading, he was accompanying. The roles were reversed. Now this was Walt's moment, Walt's field, Walt's farewell. As they reached the edge of the canopy, a whisper passed through the ranks of attendees. Those close enough to hear it would never forget what General Keating said next. "I was there too, Walt." Walt turned slightly, not fully, just enough to show he was listening. "Basra, night patrol. You carried me out before the second IED went off." Walt blinked. That memory was distant, blurred by dust, blood, adrenaline. But the voice rang familiar now. "I was the radio tech. 18. Thought I was invincible," Keating added, almost with a smile. "I never knew your name until today." Walt didn't speak. He just kept walking. But now, the silence was something else entirely. It wasn't awkward or hollow. It was reverent. Holy. The kind of silence reserved for sacred things. And then came the music. Not from the band who had yet to lift their instruments, but from the wind. Soft and stirring, weaving through the trees like a hymn, as if the earth itself had decided to pay tribute. By the time Walt reached the edge of the ceremony grounds, the entire assembly was standing. Uniforms faded and pristine, civilians and soldiers alike. Some saluted, some wept, but no one sat. He passed through them all like a ghost who'd finally come home, not to haunt but to heal. And when he finally stopped at the tree line, just before the footpath that curved back toward the edge of the cemetery, he looked over his shoulder, one last team-nod at the crowd, but at the urn. And for the first time in years, his face broke into the smallest smile. The ceremony had ended, but no one was in a hurry to leave. The honor guard had fired its final volley. The chaplain's voice had faded into the hush of reverent wind, and taps, slow and solemn, had drifted across the hillside like a final breath held just a moment longer. Yet still, the guests lingered, scattered now in clusters, quietly speaking, or simply staring at the oak-lined horizon where Walt Callan had last stood. An hour later, long after the chairs had been folded and the press had packed up their gear, a small group remained on the far side of the cemetery. They weren't there for the pageantry. They stood for something else, something quieter, older, more deeply felt. Beneath the tallest oak tree on the proper planted decades earlier, near the original boundary wall groundskeepers, had just installed a new bronze plaque. It sat flush with the earth, simple and unadorned. No spotlight, no podium, just the clean echo of truth, etched in bronze. In honor of staff, Sergeant Walter E. Callan and Beth Callan. Because honor is not given, it's carried. Walt stood before it now, alone again, but different. Not invisible, not disregarded, just quietly seen. His cane rested against the trunk of the tree, the soft breeze tugging gently at his coat. His hand was open, palm down, gently brushing the bark, as if feeling the heartbeat of something living beneath the surface. He reached slowly into his inner pocket and withdrew the patch, the one Beth had sewn, the one that had drawn laughter, then silence, then reverence. He looked at it one last time, its edges frayed, the letters slightly crooked from her trembling hands. He remembered the way she'd smiled when she finished it. "Now they'll know who you belong to," she had joked. Without ceremony, without witnesses beyond a few respectful onlookers in the distance, Walt knelt. He dug a shallow space beneath the tree with one hand and buried the patch beneath the soil. A private offering, a farewell stitched in thread and memory. He pressed the earth gently back over it, patting it smooth, and sat down on the stone bench beside the tree. He didn't cry. That wasn't his way. But his eyes shone as he looked upward, through the leaves dancing in the late afternoon sun. Beside him, General Keating appeared, quietly, without entourage. He didn't salute, didn't speak at first. He just stood there, taking in the moment. "They'll come here," Walt said, after a long silence. His voice was low, rasped by age, but resolute. Keating nodded. "They already are." Walt looked toward the cemetery path. A young soldier-roan of the boys from earlier walked alone, slowly, toward the tree. No camera, no phone, just quiet steps, and a face full of something he didn't have that morning. Understanding. He reached the tree, stopped, and stood at attention. "Sir," he said gently, "may I ask, the patch, was Beth your daughter?" Walt smiled. It was faint, but unmistakable. "No," he said. "She was my compass." The boy didn't quite understand, not yet, but he saluted anyway, and Walt nodded in return. A moment passed. Then the young man turned and walked back down the gravel path, leaving the old soldier to the company of wind, bark, and memory. As the sun lowered across the field, casting long shadows through the trees, Walt sat with his hand resting over the soil. No crowd, no flag, no applause, just the living heartbeat of a promise kept. And this time, when people passed by him, they didn't stare. They stood, because some uniforms fade. But some men never do.